This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Barbara Sarah. This is the Al Jazeera NewsHour live from London. Thanks for joining us. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, India announces plans to repatriate hundreds of thousands of its citizens stranded abroad by the coronavirus. The UK overtakes Italy, having the highest number of coronavirus deaths in Europe. Aiming to export test kits within months, we go inside the Iranian lab that's part of the international push for solutions. And game on. South Korea's baseball season restarts as the country eases restrictions on professional sports. India is launching one of the world's largest repatriation missions to help hundreds of thousands of its nationals stranded across the world by coronavirus travel restrictions. Passenger jets and warships will be used to bring workers home. Back in late March, India had suspended all flights into the country. Elsewhere, the UK has recorded another 693 deaths, taking its toll past 29,000. That means it has now overtaken Italy as the country with the highest number of deaths in Europe. In Hong Kong, restrictions are being lifted, with cinemas and bars set to reopen and secondary schools due to restart later this month. Meanwhile, in Russia, cases are continuing to spike. More than 10,000 infections have been reported now for 3 days in a row. We start our coverage in India with Victoria Gatenby.
There are an estimated 17 million Indians who work overseas. Now some of those who desperately want to return home will be able to.
The Indian government has given the go-ahead to bring back Indian citizens stuck abroad. The travel will be done either by airplanes or naval ships.
All flights into India were suspended in late March because of the coronavirus epidemic. Since then, those affected by the restrictions have been vocal in calling for a change of policy.
If you look at the Twitter accounts of all the Indian missions and the Facebook accounts, they have been flooded by these Indians who have been saying that while other countries have been bringing their citizens back, why aren't you bringing us back now? So this is basically a time for them to redeem themselves.
The Indian government says arriving passengers will be screened, segregated and quarantined, but critics are warning the virus may still spread.
According to the information from the central government, people will be put on a plane without testing first whether they have coronavirus. This is dangerous. A plane has more than 200 people. If one or two have the virus, all the passengers will be in trouble. This affects the whole country and raises the possibility of the disease spreading further.
There are also concerns that poorly paid migrants may not be able to afford a ticket home. Lawyers representing stranded clients are calling on the Indian government to do more to help.
The government could look at subsidizing or heavily discounting these tickets, especially for people who can be identified to be people who do not have the economic capability of buying that elusive ticket back home.
It's estimated there are up to 1 million Indians waiting to go home in what will be one of the world's largest international repatriation missions. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
The UK government has defended the country's rising death toll. Foreign Minister Dominic Raab says accurate comparisons cannot be made until the crisis is over.
I don't think we'll get a real verdict on how well countries have done until the pandemic is over, and in particularly until we've got comprehensive international data on all-cause mortality. But I think there's 2 points that I'd make about the way the UK has approached things. There are different ways of counting deaths. As we know, we've had that debate in this country. We now publish data that includes all deaths in all settings, and not all countries do that, so I'm not sure that the international comparison works unless you reliably know that all countries are measuring in the same way. And it also depends on how good, frankly, countries are in gathering their statistics.
And as Jonah Hall explains from London, where, of course, the UK death figures have exceeded those of Italy, making the country now the place with the highest COVID-19 deaths in Europe. As Jonah explains, the figures don't tell the full story.
The numbers by direct comparison don't tell us all that much. What they do, though, is fuel questions which are being asked here almost every day of the government now of quite why this country appears to have been so ill prepared for this epidemic, having had a good couple of weeks to look at with horror at the time, of course, what was happening in Italy, a country that had far less time to prepare, and also wider questions about quite why Western countries in general, in Europe and in the United States, were far less prepared, or appear to have been, than Asian countries. Take South Korea, for instance, after all of this, only recording just in excess of 250 deaths from coronavirus. So they fuel all the questions. They don't necessarily provide very much in the way of answers. The British public are looking and listening all the time to pronouncements from government in the daily briefing and elsewhere, from scientists and so on, about when and it might be appropriate to start lifting the lockdown that's been in place in this country and others. They're looking, of course, at the reproductive rate of the infections from COVID-19, looking for that to remain below 1, this famous R figure, the number of people that carriers with coronavirus infect. It is currently below 1, but not sufficiently below 1 to give them much wiggle room. But there's an enormous amount of pressure from industry, from business, on the government to restart the economy. The worry is that if you go too far down the road in terms of saving lives, you end up going too far down the road in terms of being able to save the economy, and that ultimately that causes more problems than it helps down the line.
As we mentioned earlier, Hong Kong is relaxing one of Asia's toughest lockdowns. It follows 2 weeks of no new domestic infections. Katrina Yu has more now from Beijing.
The government and Carrie Lam said that they were very confident that Hong Kong had stabilized its coronavirus outbreak enough to be able to ease some of those very strict measures that have been in place for weeks. So starting from this Friday, groups of up to 8 people will be able to gather in public, and they'll be able to eat together, for example, in restaurants. Previously, that maximum group number was 4. Also, some key venues, some key businesses will finally be able to reopen. That includes gyms, cinemas and theatres, some bars, as well as beauty parlors. And finally, they also announced some opening dates for schools, which many families have been looking forward to. So starting from May 27, older high school kids will be able to attend school, but they won't be all at once. Younger high school students, as well as primary school students, will be able to resume classes from the beginning of June. Now, this follows weeks of coronavirus cases in Hong Kong dwindling. In fact, in the last 16 days, there have been 0 new local infections. There have been some imported cases, but there have been very few, only single digits, if any, on some days. And it also follows months of real economic battering that Hong Kong has seen. The economy in Hong Kong declined in its first quarter this year by about 9% compared to last year. So the government is very keen to get the economy going again. But it's not quite out of the woods yet. The government said that they're going to give every Hong Kong citizen a reusable mask that they're expected to wear when they're out and about. And some businesses, including nightclubs, karaoke clubs, as well as saunas and bathhouses, will remain closed for at least another 2 weeks.
Russia has reported the largest number of new daily cases of the coronavirus in Europe, with the total number of infections now exceeding 150,000. Health workers there have been complaining about their working conditions after 2 doctors fell out of a window and died. Nadine Baba reports.
Digging graves in St. Petersburg, Russia's second city, for victims of COVID-19, a scene that's becoming more common. On Tuesday, the country reported the highest number of new coronavirus cases in Europe. And now there are disturbing questions over health workers who've raised the alarm about their working conditions.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Косякин Александр Александрович.
This video on Twitter shows Dr. Alexander Shulepov on the left and a colleague who's explaining how Shulepov had been forced to keep working despite having COVID-19. The colleague had previously criticised their hospital management for protective gear shortages and was questioned by police for allegedly spreading fake news. But another video made 3 days later, apparently at their hospital, seems to show Shulepov, by now being treated for the virus, retracting their complaints.
I feel all right. My temperature is not rising. My disease is asymptomatic. I have a runny nose. Otherwise, all is well. What we said was said when we were high on emotions.
On Saturday, according to local state television, quoting health officials, Shulepov fell from a second-floor window at the hospital. He's now reportedly in a critical condition in intensive care after suffering skull fractures. The same sources say he's the third Russian doctor to fall out of a window in the space of 10 days. The 2 others died. All 3 incidents, which are being investigated by law enforcement authorities, have prompted intense discussion in Russia about whistleblowers in the health system.
Everywhere we have a lot of problems. There are not enough hospitals. There are not enough doctors. We don't have enough medicine. We don't have enough equipment.
Across Russia, the number of recorded COVID-19 cases stands at more than 155,000, and officially the disease has killed almost 1,500 people. Moscow remains the country's worst-hit region, accounting for more than half of new cases, and here 90% of patients are younger than 65. Several cities remain on lockdown, and while much of Europe looks to ease restrictions, the Russian government says they'll stay in place until there's a vaccine.
US President Donald Trump has made a rare trip out of Washington to meet with Native Americans and tour an aerospace facility in Phoenix, Arizona, that expanded its production to manufacture respirator masks for healthcare workers. Adam Goodman is a Republican strategist and joins us now from Florida. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. This is one of the first trips that really Donald Trump has taken out of Washington, of course, because of the coronavirus pandemic and the crisis it's caused in the U.S. and elsewhere. We've also seen his approval ratings take a hit. The latest poll shows that now 42% say that Trump is doing a good job, as opposed to 46% in April. How damaged do you think this president has been by his handling of the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think that, just listening to the rest of the lead up into this interview, all over the world, everyone's having, in a way, to learn on the fly. The president was no different here in America. I think he did very, very well coming out of the box. He held, obviously, a lot of press conferences, Barbara. I think when those started to wear a little thin, he tried to look for an alternative, and you're seeing the alternative now, where he visited Arizona, the Honeywell plant, where they are manufacturing N91 masks, and will be a part of other protective equipment that will be coming online. This is a part of what America, and I think the world, is going to start to starve for, which is a shot in the arm. We know we have a health pandemic on our hands. We fear we also are looking at an economic pandemic. And it's nice, I think, just to get a sense that maybe tomorrow will be a little bit better than yesterday. And I think that, Barbara, is what the president is trying to do. You'll see a lot more of it in the days ahead. And as for the polls are, snapshots in time. The poll is really going to start to count as this fall, when I think the American people have a much better read on how the administration has done with the COVID disaster.
Of course, you're right in saying that the coronavirus has, caught a lot of countries a bit unawares, and a lot of countries are having problems. Perhaps not as many leaders are quite as optimistic as President Trump, and not as many leaders made the kind of comments that he made during the coronavirus task forces, for example, saying that people should drink disinfectant, which is one of the reasons that those press conferences aren't happening anymore. And he's also a president in an election year, and the president that thrives in front of a crowd in big rallies, which can't happen right now. How much do you think that damages his prospects for re-election?
Well, I think he has to revisit how he campaigns, as everyone has. Ask Joe Biden, whose biggest campaign trips have been between his den and his kitchen, as he's trying to communicate out from his home in Delaware. It's changed things. But it's kind of strange to say this, Barbara, but even today in Arizona, where he was socially distanced in the press conference we just saw from some of the others, the governor of Arizona, and some others of from Indian country, he felt relieved, I think, to get out of Washington, out of being sequestered, and back into play. But in the end, the bottom line in all this, and in this election to come, is really whether or not people want to change horses in the middle of a tremendous challenge, of tremendous hit not just in terms of our health security, but our economic security. I think that's where the president's going to have strong game when it's all said and done. And I think the polls are going to be all over the place depending on how we feel about how things are going today. But it's really what we want to do moving forward, and whether or not what the president has done, which is to basically, Barbara, say to Americans, let's get at it. Let's innovate. Let's go for it.
If we
I
look
think that's been really helpful.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but if we look at statistics well beyond the polls, it's nearly 1.2 million Americans infected, nearly 7,000 deaths. The infection rate is rising. Is the president putting campaigning issues ahead, actually, of the safety of the United States and Americans?
I think, Barbara, he said constantly from the beginning of this that he's putting the health of Americans first. But as president, unlike Tony Fauci, who's done an amazing job of trying to give us a sense of what the health aspects of this pandemic are, as president, you're responsible for every other part of life as well. And it's not just the thirst that people feel wanting to get out there again, to try to feel some sense of normalcy again. We have to make some very tough decisions, and so does the president, about where those lines are. And we're not going to know how it all kind of turns out until we get out there and we start to try things. And so we're going to push the envelope. We're going to, as Kevin McCarthy in the House said, we're going to learn to crawl, then walk, then run. Now, we might be doing more crawling than running right now, but at least I think the president is laying out kind of a path that Americans can say, okay, I think maybe, just maybe, I can see some of the light at the end of this tunnel.
Adam Goodman, Republican strategist, speaking to us from Florida. Sir, good to get your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Plenty more is still ahead on the NewsHour, including an attack on press freedom. President Rodrigo Duterte accused of being behind the shutdown of a Philippines TV network. And President Trump denies the U.S. is behind what it calls a failed coup in Venezuela, despite the capture of 2 Americans. Iranian scientists are collaborating with their Chinese counterparts in an attempt to improve testing for the coronavirus. Iran is one of the worst-hit countries in the Middle East, with more than 6,300 deaths. Here's Zain Bajravi from Tehran.
In laboratories like this all over the world, scientists are trying to answer the same questions. How can COVID-19 be stopped? Is there a cure? When will this global crisis be over? At the Pasteur Institute in Tehran, Iranian experts are working with Chinese colleagues to try and improve testing for the virus, something that has been a challenge since the early days of the outbreak.
So I'm coming here for just help them to give them some training and how to use the test, because they are using all products here for the testing.
Could you please stop? I'm sorry. No. Our interview with a visiting expert was cut short by security. The government here has been criticized for responding too slowly to the pandemic, and it seems officials in Tehran remain sensitive about anything related to its coronavirus response. Set up in 1920, the campus in Tehran is named for French scientist Louis Pasteur, a 19th century pioneer of modern medicine. This institute runs dozens of labs and employs hundreds of staff across the country. The government hopes research and development here will enable Iran to export diagnostic kits and medical equipment.
This facility is nearly 100 years old and one of the largest of its kind in the Middle East. For years, scientists in these kinds of labs have been fighting all manner of diseases, infectious diseases. And now their priority, the inescapable priority for these men and women, is to try to find a way to fight COVID-19.
Why is the virus more severe in some patients? Does it mutate? And can survivors develop immunity? Answers to these questions and the discovery of a vaccine in a place named after a pioneer in the field would be an outstanding achievement. And the head of the institute made it clear that is the ambition.
We are working on producing the technical knowledge for a vaccine and focusing on medicine and treatment to see which medicine could be a good candidate for curing the disease.
But on the day of our visit, Iran's president was more guarded in an address to his cabinet. Hassan Rouhani was clear. There have been no breakthroughs. Social distancing is the best policy, and everyone's in this for the long haul.
Based on the assumption that this virus will unfortunately remain with people for some time, and nobody in the world can predict when this epidemic will end, days, weeks or months. We have to observe health protocols while continuing work, production and activities. When it comes to corona, people have the major role. There is no treatment, no medication or vaccine for it. So the fundamental thing is to be careful about ourselves.
While finding a cure is the end goal, testing is also important. Last month, the Revolutionary Guards unveiled a handheld device they said was capable of detecting an infected person from 100 meters away. But its effectiveness was criticized, and Iran's health ministry did not approve it for use. With no easy fixes, scientists carry on with their research. How to end the pandemic remains an open question, and they intend to find the answer. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Tehran.
Brazil's government is resisting calls for a new field hospital to be set up in the Amazonian city of Manaus, which has become a major coronavirus hotspot. The health minister says existing facilities can be expanded, but hospitals are overwhelmed and cemeteries are struggling to cope with the growing number of victims. Teresa Boer reports.
It's the capital of the state of Amazonas, and it has become an example of the failure Brazil has to cope with COVID-19. Dozens of victims of the disease are being buried in the cemetery every day. William de Almeida lost his ankle in the past days. He has now been authorized to bury him here.
The bodies are being buried together in these mass graves. They're left in containers. There are 3 containers here. Sometimes the funeral home staff can't come in. They stay by the entrance and the coffins are stored inside these containers until they can be buried.
On the same day, relatives of those who died say the names of those buried were being put in the wrong coffins. COVID-19 apparently arrived to the city in the heart of the Amazon imported by a woman who traveled from London. 1 month and a half later, hospitals are trying to cope with a spiraling increase of infections. Jorge Akel says the whole system is failing.
Manaus had an average of 28 to 35 burials per day. Now it's more than 120. It doesn't mean that all these people are dying from COVID-19. There are other causes of death, but it's not being checked. The post-mortem examination system is lacking.
Far-right President Jair Bolsonaro is a strong opponent of isolation and has dismissed the virus poses a real threat for Brazil.
Hello, I'm Sebastian Salgado.
Famous Brazilian photojournalist Sebastião Salgado and dozens of public figures signed an open letter to the Brazilian government, calling on officials to protect the nation's indigenous people with limited access to health care. They say they are at risk of genocide. Many indigenous communities are located not far away from Manaus.
Unfortunately, I don't see it with good eyes. The doctors, the professionals, some government officials are trying to do their best. But I think things will worsen until the 6th or 8th of May. The curve will continue to rise.
A curve that has already taken thousands of lives. In a country where the president seems to be on denial about the tragedy his people are facing every day. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera.
Let's go to Libya now, where the internationally recognized government has launched an offensive to capture an airbase controlled by the warlord Khalifa Haftar. Al-Watiya has been used to launch airstrikes on government forces. The government troops recently seized control of major cities along the western coastline. And they rejected Haftar's call for a ceasefire during Ramadan, believing he'd use it to regroup following the lost territory. Our correspondent Mahmoud Abdelwahid is in Libya's capital. He says the Tripoli government is trying to cut off Haftar's supply lines.
Haftar's forces are still besieged inside Al-Watiya airbase. The most strategic airbase in the west of Libya for Haftar's forces, especially after they lost several strategic cities in the west of the country only a few weeks ago. The government military sources say that they are exchanging, or they have been rather exchanging heavy fire by artillery rockets with the forces loyal to the warlord Khalifa Haftar. And also they say that they now have full control of the air above Al-Wutiyah, thanks partly to the Turkish drones that have been controlling the air over Al-Wutiyah air base, giving the government forces a chance to cut all supplies lines coming to Haftar's forces from the south. Now, the government forces say that they lost a number of fighters in this battle for Al-Wutiyah, but they say that they can now attack Al-Wutiyah airbase from several axes, especially the direction close to the Tunisian borders.
Mahmoud Abdelwahed there. Well, earlier we spoke to Jason Pack. He is the founder of the consultancy firm Libya Analysis. He says GNA forces have now secured air superiority with support of the Turkish military.
There are two key components that the LNA, which is Haftar's army, has in western Libya. That's Tarhuna, where he has loyal allies fighting against the GNA, and then this airbase. And what's happened now that we're 13 months into the war is that for the first 12 months of the battle for Tripoli, the LNA had air superiority. And now in the last month, the GNA, with Turkish help, has secured air superiority. If Watiya falls, that air superiority will be complete. And the GNA will be able to use drones against Tarhuna and to repulse the attack on Tripoli.
The Philippines' leading broadcaster has been ordered to shut down. The Telecoms Authority says ABS-CBN's license has expired. President Rodrigo Duterte has regularly criticized the network. Opposition groups accuse him of targeting independent media. ABS-CBN has been given 10 days to respond to the decision. Jamila Alindogan is in the capital, Manila, with more.
The cease and desist order, according to the National Telecommunication Commission, is immediately executory, and that's something that the Department of Justice Secretary also said. However, based on local interviews with the commissioners of NTC, it remains to be seen how exactly NTC is going to implement that, whether they're going to need the help of law enforcement to come in and actually literally physically stop the network from airing. The letter was received officially this afternoon. ABS-CBN continues to air today. And this is a complete turnaround from what NTC said a few months ago, that it may issue a provisional authority to ABS pending its approval of the extension of its franchise in Congress. Now, the spokesperson of President Rodrigo Duterte over the past few months have said that the president has nothing to do with this, although last year the president himself threatened that he will shut down ABS-CBN because of the network's failure to air his presidential campaign ads in 2016. Now, this is seen as a major blow to press freedom. According to rights experts here, they say this is the time when the biggest media network in the country, with substations across the country, is needed for information dissemination of the current pandemic and the situation in the country. Now, despite denials from the Philippine government, experts also say that this is seen as an impervious curtailment of press freedom and also spawned by political retribution of this government.
Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro says 13 people have been captured following what he says was a coup attempt. Maduro says the group, including 2 Americans, arrived in speedboats on Sunday intending to kill him. John Holman has more.
2 Americans captured along with 11 others after a failed armed incursion into Venezuela. They tried to get in by sea, but the plan floundered off the coast. 8 were killed, according to the Venezuelan government. This man said he'd organised it. Jordan Goudreau, a US ex-Special Forces soldier turned security contractor. He was aiming to topple Nicolas Maduro together with a few dozen ex-members of Venezuela's armed forces.
At 1700 hours, a daring amphibious raid was launched from the border of Colombia deep into the heart of Caracas. Our men are continuing to fight right now.
Maduro himself claimed that his longtime enemies were behind it.
Yesterday, Sunday, May 3rd, Venezuela faced down an attempted maritime incursion from terrorist mercenaries that were trained in Colombian territory under financing and support from the United States and the current Colombian government.
On Tuesday, President Trump dismissed that.
Nothing to do with our government.
The Venezuelan government also claimed that opposition leader Juan Guaidó, recognized by more than 50 countries as Venezuela's legitimate leader, was in on the plot. He also roundly denied that, saying this was a ploy to distract from the country's many problems.
While Maduro is in power, there will be chaos, and they want to hide it. They want to hide the lack of gasoline in the main cities. They want to hide the struggle of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. Here they are, the fishermen, protesting again, asking for the rights to make a living, to buy gasoline, to feed their families. Maduro is chaos.
The opposition say they fear this will be used to persecute them. And the Maduro administration is deploying 25,000 security personnel to search for anyone else involved, they said. He's under pressure himself, not just internally, but increasingly from US officials who've slapped a $15 million bounty on his head on narco-terrorism charges. However real the threat of the incursion was, it does give his government something else to talk about. John Holman, Al Jazeera.
Still ahead this news hour, the faceless and poorly paid airport workers left struggling to survive as the coronavirus leaves airlines grounded. And the hornets from hell, giant killer insects that could wipe out bee populations, arrive in the United States for the first time.
Hello. European weather is becoming aligned such that the east is underneath the cloud with a northerly breeze and fairly frequent outbreaks of rain. Now that's been the case for a while, admittedly, but it's going to carry on. The blue represents the rain, the white's a bit of snow in there as well on the higher ground. But to the west, there's a lack now of cloud. It'll increasingly disappear, and with a breeze, either nothing at all or from the south, things will warm up. Now, it was hot in Spain yesterday, in the middle 30s along the north coast. That's come back down again, a bit more sensible. But it's still hot in southern Spain. And temperatures will tend to rise, I think, where the sun is persistent. Days are longer than nights now. And Paris represents that quite nicely. Starting off at 21, we get to 26 by the week's end. 3 days of full sunshine. On the north coast of Africa, the wind very much determines the temperature. Look at Tripoli. The forecast for Wednesday is 38. Let's reverse the wind direction and knock it back down to about 27 on Thursday. Clearly, as I say, North African coast is very much dependent on wind direction. Further south, down towards the tropics, we've got this line of blue which represents showers coming up slowly with the sun. Kenya and Tanzania have seen some heavy rain recently. There's still some on the coast, and it's likely to get heavier.
A reminder now of the top stories on Al Jazeera. India is launching one of the world's largest repatriation missions. Hundreds of thousands of its nationals stranded by coronavirus travel restrictions will be brought home. The UK has recorded another 693 deaths, taking its toll past 29,000 and making the country now the one with the highest number of deaths in Europe. After 2 weeks of no new domestic infections, Hong Kong is relaxing one of Asia's toughest lockdowns. Cinemas and bars will be allowed to reopen. Kenya shelters nearly 500,000 refugees, many of whom fled neighboring Somalia and South Sudan. They live in crowded camps and are at risk of a coronavirus outbreak with little or no access to healthcare. Malcolm Webb reports from Nairobi.
Anna Adio fled fighting in her hometown in South Sudan when she was 2 years old. Her parents brought her here to Kakuma refugee camp in northern Kenya. It's been her home ever since. Over decades, it's become a city of shacks, home to nearly 200,000 people. Trips to the water pump or the market are essential. It's the way people get food to eat. She's worried about the spread of the coronavirus in the camp.
Where we fetch water, we have to queue, and social distancing is practically impossible. That scares me.
Anna's among nearly 500,000 refugees in Kenya. Many escaped the conflicts in neighbouring Somalia and South Sudan. Most live in camps like Kakuma. So far, no cases of the virus have been identified here. But refugee rights activists say cramped conditions and the lack of healthcare could be a recipe for disaster.
Unfortunately, it means possible devastation. People who are infected will not be able to be isolated. People who, there'll be a lot of transmission. The spread will be fast and the response will be slow.
The UN's refugee agency released this video showing measures that have been taken to prevent the spread of the virus during food distributions. It says it's added extra water points for washing hands, but that doesn't change many of the realities inside and outside the camps.
Protecting refugees from coronavirus is not only about protecting refugees or about protecting host communities. Really, it's about protecting all of us. And if everyone is not protected, then the truth is none of us are protected.
People in Kenya and other parts of Africa are waiting to see if or when the coronavirus will spread as much as it has in Asia, Europe and the US. Health experts say it could be disastrous. Anna says life's already become more difficult. The crisis has pushed up food prices. She's worried about her family in the weeks ahead. She says all they can do is pray to God. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Nairobi, Kenya.
Coronavirus lockdowns implemented in some African countries have been particularly devastating for informal vendors, small-scale farmers and undocumented migrants. More than 80% of Zimbabweans earn their living from Africa's largest informal sector. Markets have been shut and the use of public taxis suspended since the end of March. In Mozambique, small-scale farmers account for 95% of the country's agricultural production. The state of emergency, declared on April 1st, has forced farmers to drop prices, with working restrictions cutting off labor. South Africa has allowed spaza shops, or informal convenience stores run from home, to operate with a permit, but undocumented migrants have been excluded from receiving financial aid or food parcels. Well, Tafi Maka is a political and social commentator. He joins us live now from Johannesburg via Skype. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Around the world, the coronavirus has forced governments to make a bit of a balancing act between the economy and the health of people. Explain to us why in Africa this is having a disproportionate effect on the economy and the lives of people there.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. The main problem African countries are facing is that there are quite a lot of issues that were predating the COVID-19 pandemic. And chiefly the issues which have come to the fore are high unemployment, poverty, and the existence of large informal economies which are not entirely integrated into how the main economies work. And what the shutdown has done is exacerbate problems around those three issues. And this is causing quite a lot of unhappiness as well as hunger. And I think a lot of skepticism about government's ability to actually handle this pandemic well, or to come up with a response that can at least accommodate the issues that most Africans face.
After Asia, Europe was the first continent to be severely hit. So I guess a lot of countries, like Italy, for example, almost made the template that then other countries followed. If not that way, if not a lockdown, then what could be the answer for some African nations in dealing with the coronavirus?
Well, I think you do need a lockdown of sorts, but I think there has to be some recognition of the fact that most people just cannot afford to sit at home. They don't have any savings. And what we did find is that in the initial implementation of the lockdowns, a lot of people fell through the cracks and they weren't able to get access to any financial aid. Some weren't able to get access to food. So a lot of people left in a situation where they couldn't work and they couldn't get any aid. and they were just facing a hopeless scenario. It's a bit better now, but the problem is some countries can't afford to actually provide the sort of aid that's required at the moment.
So explain to us, please, when you said it's getting a little better now. I mean, the lockdown has now been implemented in many African nations for several weeks. So how are people, I suppose, helping their neighbors? Well, because if a lot of employees aren't registered with the governments and so can't even qualify for compensation, what is actually happening on a ground level there?
Okay, I think people have had to make do by asking others to help. Friends, relatives, or whatever it may be. There have been NGOs coming in with help as well. And I think governments have had to sort of walk back on a few things. And they have been trying to accommodate as many people as possible. But it's still a very, very difficult situation because not everyone is in an ideal situation to get enough food or to get enough financial aid, or indeed just to get that aid. Because there are people who are in a position where they cannot work, and it looks as if they can't access any aid, and they just have to fend for themselves. So there are people who are actually in a situation where they're just caught in this no man's land where they have to make do with whatever they had or whatever they have at the moment.
Well, you wrote a fascinating article about this in more detail for the Al Jazeera website, so very interesting and a very interesting topic indeed. Tafi Maka, political and social commentator, joining us from Johannesburg. Sir, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, as the number of new cases begins to drop in some countries, Qatar is still recording hundreds of new infections every day. It now is the second highest number of cases in the Arab world, despite having a relatively small population. Talk to Al Jazeera spoke to Qatar's public health minister, Dr. Hanan Mohammed Al-Kuwari, who says most other countries haven't tested enough to know the full extent of their outbreak.
The number of cases has gone up, but that's only natural. And I believe that actually it's a result of our very strong testing measures. So as you've seen, we are testing a lot in Qatar. So we've been testing approximately 40,000 per million. So that's quite significant. That's one of the highest rates of testing. And that reflects a true picture of what's happening in terms of infection rates. So the rates are not high. They're realistic. You will find that a lot of countries at the end of their pandemic will realize that their curve actually looks like ours. So if you see the number of cases in Qatar may be high, but they're actually mild cases. So 93% of the cases are mild. Only 1% end up in ICU, and another 5% end up admitted in the hospital. And that's actually quite a good rate to have in the country, and that's because we are very active in seeking the cases. We're very active in finding cases, tracing them, isolating them, quarantining them, and therefore managing the case and situation much better.
And you can watch the full interview with Dr. Hanan Mohammed Al-Kuwari on Talk to Al Jazeera. That's at 16:30 GMT on Thursday. Arab local councils in Israel have gone on strike, saying the government discriminated against them when allocating funds to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. They say the government gave councils in Jewish-majority areas more money. The government has announced a budget worth nearly $800 million for all local councils this year, but Arab councillors say only $13 million has been allocated to them. Hundreds of boatmen in Pakistan's lakeside tourist spots are struggling to make ends meet during the virus lockdown. While the government is considering partially lifting restrictions, parks and recreational areas are not part of the plan. Kamal Haider has more now from Kanpur Lake.
Kanpur Lake, situated in the Himalayan foothills and less than 50 kilometers from Islamabad, is a favorite tourist spot, attracting thousands of tourists from around the country and from nearby areas. But as you can see, hundreds of boats are now parked idle, and the workers and owners of these boats are worried about their future.
There are over 250 boats here,
and they are all parked. This is peak season, but there are no customers and we may find ourselves out of a job.
Pakistan went into a state of lockdown on the 14th of March. All public and recreational places were closed. And that means that people who depended on these boats are now worried about their future.
These are hard times, and if this crisis prolongs, I will have to find an alternative livelihood.
The Ministry of Planning estimates that anything from 14 to 18 million people may lose their jobs. And the fear is that with an extended and prolonged lockdown, the unemployment rates could go higher. Although the government is now easing some restrictions to allow the movement of essential goods, and life is slowly coming back as far as the markets are concerned. But places such as these are likely to remain shut.
Well, other places that remain nearly shut are airports, and with most flights grounded, low-paid airport workers across the U.S. have been hit hard by layoffs. Before the pandemic, they were fighting for a pay increase. Now those who remain are facing years of financial hardship. Gabriela Elizondo reports from Philadelphia.
At Philadelphia International Airport, wheelchairs used to take elderly or immobile passengers to or from their planes and gates sit empty. And for the wheelchair attendants, many have been laid off or facing difficult choices. Like Reginald Smith, a husband and father, forced to choose between possibly contracting coronavirus at the airport and bringing it home to his family, or quitting his job, knowing it would lead to financial hardship. He chose his family's health.
My wife was high risk with diabetes, and I just had to take a precaution of her. I didn't want to get so happy when people coming all across the world and stuff, no matter who we picking up, me get it and turn around with her being at high risk, bring her home to the family.
A labor union representative says over 600 Philadelphia airport workers he represents from the Service Employees Union have been laid off. They were all contract employees hired by third-party companies.
Baggage handlers, sky caps, wheelchair attendants, plane cleaners, folks providing food. They seem to be leaving them out entirely, of the equation. And they're the ones the airlines are the ones who actually direct all that work.
At Philadelphia's airport, passenger traffic has plummeted from 90,000 travelers a day to just a few hundred a day. Of the 450 daily flights, most have been canceled. And of the 165 permanent airport stores, less than 10 remain open. It's unprecedented.
This is different. This is going to be challenging for us to come back from.
Many airport workers won't be getting their jobs back until people start flying again and airports return to how they were before the coronavirus pandemic. But some experts say that could be as long as 2 years from now. In empty airports, devoid of busy commotion, that provide livelihoods to so many people that used to work there. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera, Philadelphia.
Staying in the U.S., honeybees are in decline in the United States, and now a deadly species of hornet is threatening to wipe them out completely. The Asian giant hornet has already had an impact on bee colonies in Canada. Now the killer insects have been seen in the U.S. for the first time. Andy Gallagher reports.
They've been described as hornets from hell, and with good reason. The giant Asian hornet is about the size of a matchbox. Its sting can penetrate a beekeeper's suit, and they kill around 50 people a year in Japan. In December, the Washington State Department of Agriculture verified 2 sightings of the hornet. Reports of honeybee colonies being destroyed soon followed.
They're one of the largest hornets that we have on the planet. And so that's what makes them so unusual and makes them so striking to people. They do not occur here.
It's thought the hornets were either deliberately released or arrived as stowaways on international cargo. They become active in the spring, and scientists say just 15 of these giants can destroy an entire colony of 30,000 bees in hours. Their habit of devouring native honeybees is now a real concern.
Our biggest fear is that it will actually impact small beekeepers and maybe drive them out of business and raise costs for larger beekeepers. It's just something we don't want to see happen.
Plans are now in place to begin trapping and killing the hornets before they establish themselves as a dangerous invasive species. For years now, bees have been dying at record rates, impacted by climate change, disease and pesticides. The agricultural industry has already been fighting a battle to keep healthy colonies alive. Now there's a new threat. According to the Department of Agriculture, 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food is in some way a product of bee pollination. Crops like apples, blueberries and cherries all rely on bees. Scientists say this new threat needs to be tackled before it's too late.
Pollination is a huge part of agriculture and the agricultural systems we have here in the United States. And so if this were to become well established and then start spreading, it could be pretty catastrophic.
Members of the public are being warned not to approach the hornets if they see them. For now, they're confined to the remote northwest of the United States. Stopping them spreading further is now a priority. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera.
Anyway, you're watching Al Jazeera live from London. Still ahead. Professional sport returns to South Korea, but fans aren't yet being taken out to the ball game. South Korea is easing restrictions with sports leagues restarting. The baseball season is up and running after being postponed from the end of March. But as Rob McBride reports from Incheon, it will be some time before the sport fully returns to business as usual.
The final warm-up for the long-awaited start of the delayed baseball season, local Incheon favourites SK Wyverns take on visitors Hanwha Eagles. But conspicuously absent from the stands, their fans. Instead, many of the seats occupied by printed versions of spectators, while real fans can only watch on TV or online through a club stream that combines the action in the park with the cheering in homes.
We are hoping to deliver some of the atmosphere of the stadium to the fans at home, so they feel as though they are here at the game.
They're also joined by potentially millions of baseball fans around the world. As the third-ranked baseball-playing nation after the US and Japan, South Korea's live games are in big demand in a world starved of live sports action.
We welcome the increased attention on Korean baseball. It's great to promote it, and it's all thanks to our citizens for getting us to this stage.
South Korea's success so far in defeating the coronavirus is also allowing the Football K-League to start its season later this week. But again, without fans, in another sport for which large cheering crowds seem indispensable.
So crowds are important because they are part of what we expect when we go to see a game or when we watch a game. The noise, the tension, the drama, the anxiety, the happiness, the emotion. This is not driven by empty stadiums. This is driven by full stadiums.
South Korea's baseball teams hope to start adding the essential fan ingredient soon. Even when the fans are finally allowed back in, it'll still be a long time before we see packed stands again. Their numbers will increase only gradually with empty seats between them, and for now, their silent stand-ins will have to do. And when they do return, they'll find previously unheard of precautions for the players, such as no hugging and no spitting. The way baseball is played and the way it's watched is turning into a very different game. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Incheon, South Korea.
Well, to celebrate South Korean Children's Day during the pandemic, the country's first couple switched to the popular video game Minecraft.
어린이 여러분, 청와대에 오신 걸 환영합니다.
President Moon Jae-in and wife Kim Jong-suk offered a virtual view of their Blue House Palace instead of the traditional guided tour. Using their Minecraft characters, they thanked children for being patient with school closures and reminded them to wear masks and wash their hands. Social distancing rules are expected to be further relaxed from Wednesday when some businesses are allowed to reopen. You can find out more on the latest from South Korea and across the world, really, in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic on our website, the address aljazeera.com. And that is it from me, Barbara Sarah, for this News Hour. Do stay with us, though. I'm going to have more news in just a few minutes. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.